Storm-lashed waves hammer the hull of a Royal Navy brig as it limps into the harbour. The year is 1721, and a crowd has already gathered at the dock, drawn by rumours of an unusual prisoner. Among the battered crew and captured corsairs is a woman, her tattered gown soaked in salt water, her wrists bound in iron. She does not hang her head. This is no damsel plucked from danger. She was the danger. For months she helped command a pirate sloop off the coast of Jamaica. Now she faces judgment. The crowd gawks. Some shout in awe, others in disgust. To see a woman pirate, alive, defiant, in chains, is almost too much for the world to compute. What will become of her? Will she hang like the men beside her, or be spared as a curiosity? This is where our story begins, not with cutlasses and gold, but with endings. What happened to female pirates after they were caught? Were they punished like men, or treated as cautionary tales? Were they erased, or reborn? As we'll discover, the fate of a captured female pirate rarely followed a single script. The answers lie not only in court records, but in prisons, broadsheets, and forgotten graves. If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. In the early 18th century, often called the Golden Age of piracy, pirates who were captured typically met one of two ends: the noose or the gallows. British law was clear. Piracy was a capital offence, punishable by hanging. But when a woman was captured among a pirate crew, the rules suddenly seemed to blur. Was she a criminal, a victim, a scandal? For courts built around male perpetrators, women pirates were a legal and cultural anomaly. Take the case of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most famous female pirates in history. Captured in 1720 after a skirmish off the coast of Jamaica, both women stood trial in Spanish Town. They were tried alongside their male crewmates, including the notorious Calico Jack Rackham, and all were found guilty. But while the men were sentenced to death, Anne and Mary invoked a curious defence: pregnancy. This wasn't a ruse unique to them. Known as pleading the belly, it allowed condemned women to delay execution if they were found to be quick with child. Midwives were summoned to examine them, and in the case of Bonny and Read, both were confirmed to be pregnant. The court postponed their executions. Mary Read would die in prison months later, likely of a fever. Anne Bonny's fate remains more mysterious. Some believe her father ransomed her, others suspect she quietly returned to colonial life under a new name. Pleading the belly was more than a legal loophole. It highlighted how gender expectations shaped outcomes. While men were hanged en masse, women, even armed, violent ones, were seen through a different lens, as wayward daughters, fallen women, or scandalous novelties. One little-known case from 1685 involved a woman named Martha Farley, captured aboard a pirate ship in the Caribbean. She was spared execution, but was sentenced to branding and exile. Her name disappears from the record after that. Scholars still debate whether Farley continued to work aboard ships or disappeared into domestic anonymity. Was her punishment mercy or erasure? Not all women were tried at all. In some cases, they were simply removed from ships and quietly imprisoned or sent back to their home colonies. The ambiguity left plenty of room for discretion and bias. Punishment, it turns out, was deeply inconsistent. Some women were executed, others faded into history, and a few became something else entirely: myths. Public fascination with female pirates didn't end at the courtroom doors. It often began there. The image of a woman wielding a cutlass, dressed in breeches, standing trial among hardened men, stirred both scandal and curiosity in 18th century society. Newspaper pamphlets sold briskly, ballads were composed, and in coffee houses from London to Port Royal, the trials of Anne Bonny and Mary Read became fodder for gossip, satire, and political allegory. Why this obsession? In part because these women defied the strict social codes of the time. The 1700s were a period when women were largely confined to domestic roles, silenced in courtrooms, and denied participation in legal contracts or military life. A woman taking to the seas, fighting, stealing, leading, was more than unusual. It was unsettling. She threatened to unmoor not just ships, but the gender order itself. Mainstream records describe Anne Bonny as bold to the point of fury, and Mary Read as fierce and hardened. Such phrases were meant to shock, but they also humanized the women in a way that terrified magistrates. They were not mad women, not witches, not mere disguisers, but capable, intentional criminals. That made them dangerous. A lesser-known case, however, reveals how quickly narratives could shift. In 1743, a woman named Rachel Wall was arrested in New England, accused of luring ships toward rocky shores with false lights so they could be plundered. She was eventually hanged, not for piracy, but for highway robbery. Yet in the press, her story was rebranded as that of a sea witch siren, seducing men to doom. The actual facts of her crimes were overwritten by metaphor and myth. Scholars still debate whether these portrayals reflected reality or served as morality tales. Were these women glamorized exceptions or warnings? Either way, they occupied a strange space in cultural memory, both condemned and romanticized. This duality only deepened over time. In Victorian England, for example, books and penny novels began to resurrect pirate women as heroines, half rebels, half victims. A century earlier, they were hanged. Now they were tragic figures of forbidden freedom. The spectacle of female pirates on trial offered a mirror. It showed society's fascination with rebellion, and its deep discomfort with women who refused to follow the script. Anne Bonny allegedly told her jailers, "If you had fought like a man, you wouldn't hang like a dog." Whether true or apocryphal, the quote echoes still, not as a confession, but as a challenge. Punishment didn't end with the verdict. For captured female pirates, the sentence, often death, was just one part of a longer, murkier aftermath. The gallows loomed, but so did prison cells, exile, and sometimes an eerie silence. The fates of many women who turned to piracy remain unrecorded, their stories trailing off in the footnotes of maritime archives. Take Anne Bonny and Mary Read again, two of the best documented female pirates in history. After their 1720 trial in Jamaica, both were sentenced to hang, but both pleaded the belly, a legal tactic claiming pregnancy to delay execution. It worked. Mary Read died in prison months later, likely of fever or complications from childbirth. Anne Bonny, however, vanishes from the official record after 1721. Some claim she was quietly released. Others believe she escaped, returned to piracy, or lived out her life in obscurity under a new name. No one can say for sure. This phenomenon, disappearance post-capture, is common. Many female pirates simply fall off the map. Why? Scholars still debate whether it was due to poor record-keeping, deliberate cover-ups, or social pressures that led women to hide their identities once back on land. Those who didn't disappear often faced gendered punishments. In 1685, a pirate named Christina Anna Skytte was captured in Sweden. Her male accomplices were executed immediately. Christina, however, was sentenced to life in a convent, an act that suggests a mix of moral reform and public containment. In the eyes of the court, a deviant woman could be corrected, reshaped into docility. But not all were spared. Rachel Wall, mentioned earlier, was hanged in 1789. In her final confession, she admitted to luring ships but denied ever killing anyone. Her words were printed in local papers, not for sympathy, but to reinforce a moral warning. Women who strayed would face the rope, same as men. A quirky case emerges in the story of Sayda al-Hurra, a 16th century pirate queen of the Moroccan coast. After losing her position of power, she faded into exile. Not prison, not execution. Instead, she lived quietly in the mountains. Her status as both royalty and pirate afforded her a peculiar leniency. In some colonies, female pirates were used symbolically, publicly humiliated, shaved, branded, or paraded. These punishments were not just retribution, but social theatre. The message was clear. This is what happens when women defy their place. Yet even in punishment, the system could not fully control them. The gaps in documentation, the legends that emerged, and the whispered stories suggest that some may have reinvented themselves, outlaws turned farmers, mothers, or ghosts of the sea. The oceans may have been lawless, but gender was not. In the rigid hierarchies of the early modern world, a woman at sea was already suspect, whether a sailor's wife in disguise or a storm-bringing omen. So when a woman took up arms, boarded ships, and shared rum with cutthroats, society didn't just see a pirate, it saw a threat to the natural order. Captured female pirates often faced trials not only for their crimes, but for who they were. Court records from the 17th and 18th centuries reveal a recurring theme. Women on trial for piracy were simultaneously judged for being unnatural, shameless, or mannish. Their behaviour confounded norms. and prosecutors leaned heavily on that shock to secure conviction. Scholars still debate whether these character attacks were strategic, designed to strip female pirates of public sympathy, or simply reflections of genuine cultural fear. Either way, these portrayals often overshadowed the crimes themselves. Anne Bonny wasn't just a pirate. She was a harlot in breeches. Mary Read was a monster of her sex. Their violence was seen as doubly offensive, criminal and unfeminine. This treatment extended beyond the courtroom. In public executions, female pirates were often displayed as curiosities. A woman's body swinging from the gallows was meant to be more than justice. It was spectacle. The visual message was blunt. Women who broke boundaries met the same fate as men, but with a louder shame. One strange detail? In some executions, women were burned rather than hanged. This was not necessarily due to the nature of their crimes, but the law's uneasy relationship with punishing women in the same way as men. Burning was seen, paradoxically, as more dignified for certain female convicts. It also erased the body, perhaps a final attempt to blot out what their lives had defied. But not every woman was punished equally. Nobility, beauty, pregnancy, or powerful connections could shift a sentence. Anne Bonny's wealthy father may have saved her. Saida al-Hura's royal status shielded her. Others simply vanished from prison rosters, aided perhaps by bribery or sympathetic jailers. Still, for most, the outcome was bleak. The legal system, rooted in patriarchal values, didn't know what to do with women who refused their roles. So it made examples of them, through execution, erasure, or rebranding as cautionary tales. And yet, those same stories, twisted and weaponized, ensured their names endured. The law tried to silence them, but in doing so, it wrote them into legend.
But what if a female pirate wasn't executed?
What if she vanished instead? For every dramatic hanging in the square, there were quieter fates. Less public, but just as telling. Some captured women simply disappeared from the record after sentencing. Their names struck through on prison ledgers, their ships forgotten. And from these gaps, a strange pattern emerges. Silence as both punishment and escape. Mainstream records show that some women were quietly pardoned or had their sentences commuted. Mary Read, for example, died in prison in 1721, but not at the gallows. She succumbed to what records call a fever, possibly worsened by pregnancy. Her end was lonely, obscure, and unceremonious. For someone who once brandished pistols on Caribbean decks, it was an anticlimactic fall into bureaucracy. Scholars still debate whether Read's death spared her from execution, or whether it was part of a broader strategy to hush up female pirates who attracted too much public attention. Executing them made martyrs. Hiding them made history forget. Others may have escaped altogether. One fringe theory suggests Anne Bonny was quietly released and lived out her life under a false name in Charleston, South Carolina, as a respectable woman. Parish records do show an Anne Bonny who died decades later, buried with little fanfare. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the idea of a pirate queen fading into domestic obscurity is haunting and curiously plausible. There are also cases of female pirates being forcibly reassigned into traditional gender roles. In some colonial ports, captured women were married off, conscripted into labour, or placed in convents, a kind of social laundering designed to clean them of their crimes and fold them back into acceptable society. One bizarre tale tells of a Portuguese pirate woman sentenced not to prison or death, but to serve 10 years as a laundress for the navy. From raiding galleons to scrubbing uniforms, a poetic inversion of power intended to tame by humiliation. Yet even in these quieter fates, resistance lingered. Some women reportedly refused food or mutilated themselves in prison. Others used the legal system to delay sentencing, exploiting pregnancy or feigning madness. A few even wrote letters to influential men, pleading, bargaining, threatening. They refused to be simple prisoners. Silence, in this context, is not peace. It's another kind of erasure, less visible than the noose, but just as final. Still, whispers persist. In port cities and prison islands, in family trees and old church books, we find traces. Evidence that at least some of these women lived on, not as pirates perhaps, but as ghosts in the margins of history.
Of course, not all captured female pirates were content to fade into obscurity. A handful used their notoriety as currency, recasting themselves not as criminals but as celebrities of the sea. In an era before Instagram or tabloids, pirate trials were among the few public spectacles where women could become infamous overnight, and some leaned into that spotlight. Take the case of Jeanne de Clisson, a French noblewoman turned pirate in the 14th century. After her husband was executed for treason, Jeanne sold her estates, bought a warship, and embarked on a bloody vendetta against the French crown. Though her piracy predates the so-called Golden Age, her legend endured, and after capture, she was treated as more of a political agitator than a sea bandit. She eventually retired to England and lived under royal protection. No rope, no prison, no shame. Closer to the 18th century, a few female pirates found that scandal could be softened by social status. Charlotte de Berry, whether real or partly mythical, was portrayed in 19th century accounts as a tragic heroine, a woman forced into piracy by betrayal and circumstance. Her story was repackaged as romantic folklore, blurring the line between criminal and icon. Mainstream records show that some captured pirates dictated memoirs from their cells. These dying confessions were often printed and sold by local publishers hungry for moral tales. Female pirates in particular became the stars of these cautionary tracts. Their stories were sharpened into parables of virtue lost, punished, and sometimes redeemed. Quirky detail: in London, a pamphlet purporting to tell the true confession of Mary Wolverston, Pirate and Jezebel, became a surprise hit in 1725. It was part scandal sheet, part sermon, part softcore drama, and completely unverified, but readers couldn't get enough of it. Scholars still debate whether these stories were ghost-written, sensationalized, or even fabricated entirely, but they shaped public perception more than any courtroom transcript. Through print, the image of the female pirate could morph into martyr, monster, or misunderstood soul, whatever sold copies. In a sense, this was a form of agency. These women, or those writing about them, reasserted control over their narratives. Even in defeat, they stirred curiosity, provoked gossip, and refused to be forgotten. It's worth noting that male pirates rarely received this treatment. Their tales were often flattened into brutality. But women, they became pulp heroines, moral lessons, titillating tabloid stars. Their gender made them deviant, and therefore, to the public, irresistible. So while some pirates died in silence, others lived on in ink, not as themselves perhaps, but as symbols. Stories that, once told, could not be easily buried. But not every captured female pirate faced the hangman's noose or the historian's pen. Some, through sheer luck or clever manoeuvring, vanished from record altogether. In these cases, silence wasn't defeat, it was survival. It's one of the most intriguing wrinkles in the pirate story, the disappearing act. Sometimes a woman aboard a pirate ship was never officially recorded as a pirate at all. The chaotic nature of maritime warfare, confusion of sudden capture, and the sheer novelty of a woman in a pirate crew often led to murky outcomes. In several known cases, women passed as men right up until their trial, or avoided it entirely by vanishing before authorities could act. Mainstream example, Mary Read, one of the most famous female pirates, reportedly died in prison of a fever before she could be executed, but the exact details of her death are sparse, and some fringe historians have speculated she may have escaped with help. Her grave, notably, has never been found. In colonial Jamaica and the Bahamas, court records list unnamed female prisoners who were released without charge after raids on pirate havens. Were they captives, wives, pirates themselves? The record doesn't say, but the possibility lingers that some were quietly allowed to go free, either because of doubt, disinterest, or unspoken deals. One quirky tale from a 1718 Jamaican court mentions a woman found dressed as a sailor among the crew of Captain Brant, who was not tried but instead placed in the custody of the local rectory. No further mention exists. Was she protected by church officials? Married off? Disguised again and fled? Scholars still debate whether these vanishing women were systematically overlooked or deliberately erased. Perhaps some had influential friends. Perhaps colonial officials preferred not to scandalize polite society with the spectacle of a woman on trial. Or perhaps, as some suggest, Women in pirate crews simply didn't fit into the black and white moral framework of the era's courts, and so they were shuffled off the page. Of course, in some cases, women themselves chose silence. After capture, they may have changed names, fled colonies, remarried, or settled in distant ports. The sea offers many exits, and for those who knew how to read its rhythms, disappearance could be the ultimate victory. In the end, a missing name in a dusty court ledger may speak volumes. These women didn't get the drama of a hanging or the myth of a memoir, but they may have found something rarer, a second life.
Even when female pirates were captured and tried, the consequences didn't always align with popular expectations. Some were imprisoned for months or years without execution, while others were pardoned altogether, though not always for reasons we might admire. Gender, class, and even theatrical value often shape these outcomes far more than justice. One documented example is Rachel Wall, sometimes considered the last American female pirate. Born in Pennsylvania and active in the late 18th century, she was convicted not of piracy, but of highway robbery. Despite pleading for her life, she was hanged in Boston in 1789. Her trial received sensational attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the novelty. A woman sentenced to death was still a rare and titillating spectacle. But many more female pirates never made it to the scaffold. In some cases, they were simply imprisoned until they were forgotten. In others, they were released under the vague umbrella of insufficient evidence, or pardoned due to political shifts, especially if they could argue, credibly or not, that they were coerced or mere passengers. A striking example of leniency is the 1720 trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Both were sentenced to hang. Both claimed to be pregnant, what courts called pleading the belly. In accordance with English law, their executions were stayed. Mary supposedly died in prison. Anne's fate is murkier. No record of her execution exists, leading some to speculate that she was quietly released, possibly to live a private life under a new identity. One theory posits she returned to her wealthy father in the Carolinas. Quirky detail. In a few rare cases, convicted female pirates were offered pardons if they agreed to marry settlers or soldiers in struggling colonies, a colonial strategy to civilize remote outposts. The details are thin, but hints of this practice appear in letters between governors and crown officials. Whether any such marriages were voluntary is another matter entirely. Scholars still debate whether gender helped or harmed women at sentencing. Did the courts show mercy to women because of patriarchal norms? Or were these decisions just as likely to serve political ends, avoiding public backlash, reinforcing ideas of feminine weakness, or simply tidying up inconvenient trials? What's certain is that punishment was rarely consistent. While some women were paraded as examples of moral decay, others were tucked quietly away, leaving modern historians with puzzle pieces and possibilities. In a system designed by men for men, women could be punished, but they could also be forgotten, redefined, or erased. While official records often trail off after a female pirate's sentencing or imprisonment, folklore and regional legends pick up where history leaves off. These stories, blending half-truths, local pride, and centuries of embellishment, offer strange afterlives to women once branded criminals. In the Caribbean, tales circulate about Anne Bonny escaping prison and retiring anonymously to a plantation in Jamaica. Some stories say she became a healer, others claim she ran a tavern where she secretly helped enslaved people escape. There's no solid evidence for any of it, but the persistence of these legends speaks to something deeper: the public fascination with rogue women who refuse to be tamed. In Ireland, Granium Whale, better known in English as Grace O'Malley, is remembered not as a pirate queen but as a national folk hero. Although she lived centuries before the golden age of piracy, her legend overlaps with it in spirit. Songs, statues, and school curricula celebrate her naval campaigns and diplomatic cunning. A 1593 meeting with Queen Elizabeth I is recounted with near-mythic reverence. Here the pirate becomes patriot, her crimes reframed as resistance. A more obscure case is that of Qing Shi, the Chinese pirate leader who, after commanding one of the largest pirate fleets in history, accepted a government pardon and retired comfortably in Guangdong. She opened a gambling house and died a wealthy woman in 1844. Her post-pirate life is perhaps the most successful on record, yet she's still largely excluded from Western pirate law. Quirky tidbit: in some coastal communities of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia,
Locals swear that female pirates buried treasure on cliffside trails, marked not by X's but by carved symbols only women could interpret. No treasure has been found, of course, but some carved rocks do exist, sparking debates between folklorists and archaeologists. Scholars still debate whether these afterlives reflect genuine oral memory or the human need to fill gaps with narrative. Did Anne Bonny truly escape? Did Qing Shi's retirement symbolize reform, or just a smarter form of piracy? Are the legends wishful thinking, attempts to redeem women once cast as monstrous? Regardless, these folk retellings perform a quiet rebellion against historical erasure. They reclaim agency, even when records vanish. They allow women like Mary Read, Rachel Wall, and countless unnamed others to persist, not only as convicts or curiosities, but as complex figures who refuse to vanish entirely into the footnotes of male-dominated history. In a way, these legends do what the courts and ledgers never could. They let these women live on, not as victims or villains, but as something more enduring.
While legends romanticize the fates of some female pirates, modern media has amplified their stories in bold new ways. From penny dreadfuls to prestige television, portrayals of women pirates reflect evolving cultural anxieties and aspirations about gender, rebellion, and power. In the 18th and 19th centuries, cheap novels and broadsheets painted female pirates as titillating curiosities. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were frequently depicted in melodramatic duels, disguised in trousers, sometimes seducing men, sometimes slashing them down. These were not history lessons, they were morality plays wrapped in scandal and lace. The message was clear: step outside the norms, and you'll either be punished or sensationalized. By the 20th century, film adaptations leaned hard into swashbuckling stereotypes. The 1951 movie, Anne of the Indies, turned piracy into romance, complete with eyeliner and billowing sails. Critics at the time dismissed it as pulp, but it broke ground in one respect. It placed a woman at the helm of a ship, commanding fear and loyalty without male disguise. That alone challenged post-war gender roles. More recently, shows like Black Sails and Our Flag Means Death have reimagined the pirate world with greater nuance and inclusivity. Characters like Anne Bonny are given backstory, agency, and ambiguity. No longer just sword-wielding novelties, they become portraits of women navigating brutality, loyalty, and freedom in lawless worlds. Quirky detail: a recent trend on TikTok sees users piratifying themselves, creating elaborate costumes inspired by historic female pirates. Hashtags like Anne Bonny Core and Pirate Talk attract millions of views, blending cosplay, historical trivia, and feminist commentary in short, stylized bursts. Scholars still debate whether this media resurgence truly educates or simply replaces one myth with another. Are we getting closer to the historical truth, or just projecting modern values onto the past? Does Anne Bonny become more real through screen time, or more distant? What's clear is that stories of female pirates resonate powerfully today, not just for their daring, but for what they symbolize: resistance to confinement, refusal to conform, and the willingness to rewrite one's role. In a world where women still fight for autonomy in many spheres, the pirate, a figure outside law, nation, and expectation, becomes both cautionary tale and secret wish. Perhaps that's why these stories endure. They're not about treasure or even survival. They're about freedom, the kind you seize, not the kind you're given. And in that sense, every portrayal, every song, every costume becomes its own small rebellion. Long after the cannons fell silent and the sea lanes were charted, the legacies of female pirates continued to echo, often in unexpected places. In law, in literature, even in maritime policy, their brief but vivid disruptions left ripples we still feel. In the early 18th century, the pirate panic that gripped colonial authorities wasn't just about treasure, it was about disorder. Female pirates, rare though they were, became symbolic of social chaos. Their trials helped shape evolving legal norms, particularly regarding gender and criminality. For instance, the 1721 trial of Mary Read and Anne Bonny didn't merely prosecute piracy, it forced the court to reckon with their gender. Their very presence in the dock was treated as scandalous, almost impossible. That legal discomfort reverberated in how colonial courts viewed women's agency for decades after. One unexpected site of influence? The Merchant Shipping Act of 1835. While it didn't mention piracy directly,
Some historians argue that its rigid clauses about who could captain British vessels and how women were excluded reflected deeper anxieties rooted in earlier, unruly figures, including female pirates. The sea, like the vote, was not to be theirs. Quirky detail. In the late 19th century, a group of suffragists in New York staged a parody pirate trial to protest unequal sentencing laws. Dressing as Anne Bonny and Mary Read, they mocked the idea that male judges could determine a woman's fate based on chivalry or revulsion. Their performance made local headlines under the cheeky banner, "Trial by Corset." Scholars still debate whether female pirates truly altered maritime law or were simply absorbed into its tightening grip. Were they catalysts for reform or cautionary tales used to justify exclusion? The evidence is scattered, fragmentary as driftwood, but it's enough to suggest that their presence at sea left more than sensational headlines. And perhaps the most lasting legacy isn't in statutes or case law, but in the imagination. In schoolbooks, museum plaques and naval archives, the idea of a woman taking the wheel, literally and figuratively, still sparks tension. Even now, only a small percentage of maritime captains globally are women. Yet when they do take command, the lineage is clear, even if unofficial. The spirit of Ching Shi's defiance, Anne Bonny's rage, or Mary Read's disguise sails quietly with them, not as myth but as memory, as a challenge, as a whisper that centuries of silence could never fully drown out. The world may no longer hang pirates, but it still resists those who step off script, especially if they do so at sea.